Let's start with the pieces, the most important part of a Tetris-style puzzle game. There are a lot of possible ways you can draw a piece. If you check other Tetris-like games, you'll see shiny pieces, flat pieces, or round border pieces. The important part is to make them nice looking and consistent with the rest of the game's style. Now, I can't possibly go through every way you can make a Tetris piece, but I can show you the most common styles you see in Tetris-style puzzle games. From there you can mix and match and use your creativity to come up with nice looking visuals for your game. But before we begin, I want to call attention to the way Tetris pieces and the whole game is constructed. In most styles you'll see a Tetris piece made by using perfect squares. These squares are rearranged in groups of 4 to make the classic shapes of Tetris. Of course, if you are making a Tetris-inspired puzzle game that's not a Tetris clone, then you could arrange them in any shape you may want. But if it is at least inspired by Tetris somehow, chances are that the pieces are built by using this rule of constructing them using squares. Let's start with the basics, the classic Game Boy style of flat-looking Tetris pieces. First, pick the rectangle tool. We want a square, right? So at the moment of drawing the rectangle, hold Ctrl. This will make the rectangle snap to an angle. The Game Boy style had a clear outline, so give it a stroke and pick a color. I'm gonna be using the fill and stroke dialog, cause later in a minute I'll be using a couple of features from there. As always, I prefer to set the colors using the Hsl mode, and I recommend you to use it. You'll see why in a minute. You could leave it here and build your shapes with this simple square. But let's add some basic detail. Select the square and duplicate it with Ctrl D. Now the duplicate version is here on top and selected. So what I want to do is to inset the square a bit, so hold Ctrl and Shift at the same time, and using any of the arrows, scale in. Now you should disable the color of the inner square. You'll see why in a minute. Okay, one last step to finish up your first tile. For this we need enable the snapping options. So find the snap bar and click on the very first button. Now the next few options should be toggled on by default, but in case they are not, make sure that the first button in the second group of options in the bar is toggled on. And also make sure the third button of the second group is also toggled on. Now with those snapping options enabled, pick the pen tool and making straight lines, click on the 4 corners, making this trapezoid shape, connecting the corners of the 2 squares. If the snapping options are enabled, you should see this little X just before putting the nodes. It's very important that you complete the whole trapezoid shape, not just connect the corners, because we are giving it color later on. Make all 4 trapezoid shapes. Now there is one last little detail that you may have noticed. Take a look at the corners of the square. You'll notice this stroke section sticking out. This belongs to the trapezoid corners, so let's fix it. The problem is in the node's join type. By default, the program joins all corners with a nice sharp corner joint. And this works great for most of the shapes, but it may end up creating these long corners that stick out too much. We can change the joint type of all joints in a shape by going to the Stroke Style tab in the Fill and Stroke dialog, and here you'll see these 3 options. Pick the second one. Most of the time you'll want your shapes to have the sharp type joint, so there's no need to worry about these options too much. And here is it, the basic building block for your Tetris pieces. Now to change the color, just select the back shape, the only one with fill, and give it color. There are a lot of small changes you can do with this shape. For example, you could make the outline thicker than the inner lines, or maybe change the proportions of the inner square. Make it larger or smaller. Or maybe you could delete the trapezoid shapes and make the pieces a bit more simple. Before continuing, here is a nice tip to handle complex objects. You can select all objects and hit Ctrl G to group everything. Now you can handle it as if it were a single object, which is way more comfortable to work with since you don't have to worry about accidentally moving some part. And if you don't want to modify something, you can just as easily ungroup it by hitting Ctrl-Shift-G. To actually build your Tetris pieces is super simple. Make sure snapping is enabled, select the squares and duplicate them. Place them one right next to each other. If you're going for a traditional Tetris game, remember that all Tetris pieces are made of 4 of these tiles. And save this tile, because we'll be reusing it later. But now I want to show you another super simple style for pieces that you see all the time. Draw a square, but this time using the built-in modifier, round the edges a bit. Now give it a color. Give the stroke a darker shade of the fill color. Now here is a quick technique to give a shape's fill or stroke a color that is darker or lighter than the one in other shape. For this we are gonna use the Hsl Color Selection mode in the fill and stroke dialog. So first, sample the color that you want to make darker or lighter. In this case I'm using the dropper tool. The default shortcut is the D key, so it's super easy to use. And since I want to change the color of the stroke rather than the fill, when I sample the color, I want to hold Shift. And this will apply the color to the stroke of an object, rather than the fill. Now the fill and the stroke of the square have the same color. And that's what we want, because now we can go to the Stroke tab, and in the Hsl Color Selection mode, go to the L slider. This slider controls how dark or light a color is, and here you can see that to the left of the color it gets darker, and to the right it gets lighter. In this case I'll move it just a bit to the left, so it's a bit darker than the fill. And a nice thick stroke. Now for the next part we are gonna need to enable snapping again. And again make sure the same 2 buttons are toggled on. Even if a built-in rectangle has the borders rounded a bit, if you have those options enabled in the snap bar, you can still snap to the corners. I suppose that is because you are applying a modifier, so technically the nodes are still in the corners hidden. Anyway, just pick the pen tool and create this triangle by snapping to the edges. You don't want those corners of the triangle that stick out of the square. To cut that area that leaves the silhouette of the square, you could use an intersection. So duplicate the square using Ctrl D, select the duplicated square and the triangle. You may need to zoom in a bit to be able to select the 2 shapes using the Shift key. And now hit Ctrl* to perform the intersection operation. Because only the intersection between the 2 shapes is left, the excess that sticked out of the rounded square is gone. Now it's up to you to make this shape a darker or lighter shade by using the same technique I showed you a minute ago. Sample with the dropper tool and pick the color with the L slider. It's almost done. If you zoom right in, you'll see that the new shape that is on top is blocking half of the stroke of the square. This is due to the way Inkscape places the strokes. This, however, has a very simple solution. Just duplicate the square and it will be placed on top. And now simply hide the fill. And it's done. Now you can group it if you want. Again, there are a lot of small variations you can make, like changing the roundness of the square, adding a curvature to the triangle, or even completely changing the triangle shape. You should definitely experiment by yourself and see what you can come up with. This next one is admittedly a bit gimmicky, but it's really easy and fun to do, and it looks really good, so it won't hurt to learn how to make them. We're gonna create some fake 3D pieces. First, build your Tetris shape by placing a square and duplicate them with Ctrl D, just to make sure the proportions are correct. I recommend you to select all 4 squares and perform a union by using Ctrl and plus. This will join all 4 objects into a single path, so it's easier to control. Duplicate the shape and move it a bit up or down depending on what you want, and then left or right. Now, using the pen tool and with the snapping options enabled, fill the side planes by creating this parallelogram that connects the 2 shapes. And make this for each individual side plane. Now here comes the fun part. You need to give color to each of the planes. But there are some rules. First, you have to think where is the imaginary light. Most of the time you'll want a top or front light, so the planes will have to be lightened accordingly. Use the same technique I showed you before to select the lightness of the different planes. Here's a quick illumination setup that is good enough for these simple pieces. The front plane, the one that defines the shape, will have the color that you want. In this case I picked this light orange. We'll have either a slightly lighter or darker shade of that color. All planes that point to the same direction should have the same color. And the planes that point to the side will usually be the darkest shade. And that's it. Remember that this is supposed to be a fake 3D effect, so there is no need to get into realistic projection or anything like that. Depending on where you position the copy that's gonna be the front side of the piece, you'll get different views and depthness.